Hey guys, it's Bree. I wanted to talk about Planetfall by Emma Newman. I finished it this last week. It's really interesting. You might know Emma Newman from her Split World series. She's been in just a ton of anthologies, has done just so many short stories, and she also does a weekly podcast called Tea and Jeopardy. And this book in particular is different from her other novels. So the Split World series is a fantasy series, and this is kind of more in the sci-fi vein. It is about a woman named Renata, or Run, who is part of a colony that's off planet. She was born on Earth, and when her friend Sumi decides to go and pursue what she's calling God's City and taking a colony out there, Ren goes with her. It's not really clear whether she leaves entirely for scientific reasons or kind of cultish reasons, or simply because she wants to leave Earth. It's kind of implied that the Earth is falling apart. And so she goes, and it's been about 20 years since they made Planetfall. At the point that they made Planetfall, some bad stuff happened to Sumi. And Ren is dealing with the aftermath. She is a 3D printing engineer, so she does the programming and design and execution and maintenance of their 3D printers. And 20 years after the fact, after they've landed and have started to make their colony, Sumi's grandson appears in their colony, and kind of it shakes stuff up. Ren is left now to face some pretty dark stuff in her past. She is kind of made vulnerable by this situation, both emotionally and possibly physically. Ren suffers from some very severe anxiety. At first, you think it's kind of just a panic attack thing. It seems very manageable, and then you realize as the story goes on how severe her mental illness is. It's a very interesting story. Very interesting, very well done, I think. To me, this is so very different in tone from the Split World series. I felt like the Split World series was kind of a junk food book, right? Like, super fun to read, really fast-paced. You can totally binge read it. But it wasn't like the most heavy-hitting, make-you-think kind of story. Whereas I'm struck by how impactful and insightful Planetfall is. I think it's just really, really well handled. And Newman shows really great insight into some really serious problems that people face. The character building in this, I think, is really, really good, especially with Ren. The side characters are all interesting. They all are kind of obviously people who are living in a complicated situation. Ren is the primary focus of the story. She's the main character, and I thought she was just fantastic. She's the kind of character who you like right away. You can see she's kind of maybe a little bit wound tight. The best part was how very, very subtly Newman introduces the kind of realities of Ren's situation. Ren suffers from some very, very severe mental illness. And Newman, I think she slowly introduces that illness into the story, which I really liked, because I think when you first meet somebody who has very severe mental illness, it's not always very apparent. And it's not always something that you think is as large of a deal as it is, until all of a sudden you realize, oh my gosh, this is really a problem. And I think it's really well handled the way that the side characters kind of are aware that something is wrong, but in a way they kind of enable Ren. They kind of downplay that she's ill and kind of chalk it up to quirkiness, which I think is fairly realistic. And as a character, with Ren in particular, you really empathize with her. Newman is really, really good at explaining the emotional state that Ren is in and really showing her, when she's distressed, she shows the distress really well. Like, you feel like you're in Ren's shoes, and I thought that was really well done. The plot is a little slow. It's not necessarily the focus of the story. It is fairly interesting, and there's some really, really cool stuff that happens. But it's kind of a secondary thing. I would say it's more of a character story than it is a plot. I think there's enough plot there to keep you interested if you're more plot driven, but I do think it's more of a character study of a story. And there are a lot of problems that are kind of pointed at when Sumi's grandson appears, that I think don't really necessarily get resolved by the end. It's not such a big deal because they're not the focus of the story. Sumi's grandson's appearance is kind of more of the catalyst than the actual overarching plot point. And so it wasn't terribly bothersome that some of that gets dropped, but it does kind of sometimes feel like it got ignored. Like I said, it wasn't such a big deal for me because I didn't think it was the primary focus of the story. But if that's something that's going to bother you, I think that might be a thing to consider. The world building in this is really, really neat. So the colony goes to this planet, right, to live at God's City. And they are trying their hardest to live in a sustainable way. They kind of, even though they live on a colony, on a planet where they can incorporate things into their system, they try to live as much of a closed system as possible, which I think is really interesting. So for instance, all of their habitats are organically created. They recycle sun use and have really a focus on maintaining as much of their resources and keeping those going through the system in as sustainable of a way as possible. And I really like that because I think when you have lived in a ship that would go on such a long journey, I think the natural extension would be to kind of keep most of those recycling technology in one, because it's the technology that you have on hand, but also I think it kind of becomes habit, and so you want to maintain what you have. And Newman does it in a really interesting way. They grow their beds, for instance, out of this sponge. And reading about that was super cool. I really, really liked it. I could picture their kind of town or village or whatever you would want to call it in my head and kind of see what the buildings would look like and how they're all connected. I really liked it. I think it's one of the things that Newman did just fantastically well in this story. Overall, this is a book that I think is worth the read. It is just extremely well done. I think it's the kind of story that leaves you feeling like you've been punched in the gut, but in a good way. I read this and there were parts where I was just like, my whole heart hurt. And again, in a good way. If you have read Planetfall, let me know. I would love to hear your thoughts on it. As an aside, Planetfall came out straight to paperback, which Newman did with her other series as well. And I really like that she's had her books come out straight to paperback. I tend to be more of a paperback reader than a hardcover reader, although if you look over here, I do read hardcover. But I love that. It makes me smile a little bit. I hope you're having a fantastic reading week. I will talk to you later. Bye.